I am Gwen, 33 years old, and I was the oldest and most invisible intern at Vanguard Investments. I was used to keeping my head down after my family stripped away my inheritance and threw me out on the street to protect their golden child. But my quiet existence shattered the morning I saw a deaf old man in a worn-out coat being openly mocked by our elite front desk staff. When I stepped out of line to greet him in sign language, I thought I was simply helping a lost stranger. I had absolutely no idea the CEO of the company was watching my every move through the security cameras, or that this fragile-looking old man was about to hand me the ultimate weapon to destroy the family that ruined me. If you have ever been underestimated because of your age or your quiet nature, hit that like button and subscribe. You are going to want to see how one simple act of kindness allowed me to bring down an entire empire of lies. Stepping into Vanguard Investments was like walking into a cathedral of cold, hard cash. The floors were polished Italian marble, and the air smelled of expensive espresso and ruthless ambition. At 33, I was a financial analyst intern, surrounded by fresh-faced 22-year-olds from Ivy League universities. They walked with the kind of arrogant swagger that only comes from trust funds and unearned confidence. They wore designer suits and spoke loudly about their weekend trips to the Hamptons. I wore practical shoes and off-the-rack blouses carrying a heavy secret that I guarded with my life. 5 years ago, my life was entirely different. After a brutal betrayal by the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally, I was forced to start over from absolute zero. I swallowed my pride, took an unpaid internship, and fetched coffee for kids, a decade younger than me, just to get my foot back in the door. I was brilliant with numbers, but at Vanguard, interns were meant to be seen and not heard. We were the bottom of the food chain, disposable and completely invisible. That particular Tuesday morning started like any other. I was standing near the towering glass entrance holding a stack of quarterly projection reports that I had spent all night color-coding. A commotion near the main reception desk suddenly caught my attention. The receptionist was a girl named Brittany who spent more time checking her reflection in her phone screen than assisting visitors. Standing in front of her high-curved desk was an elderly man. He looked completely out of place in the sleek, ultra-modern lobby. He wore a faded brown cardigan and thick glasses. He looked fragile, his shoulders stooped, gesturing frantically with his hands. Brittany was rolling her eyes, speaking at an obnoxiously loud volume as if shouting would magically make the man understand her. "I cannot help you if you do not speak English," she practically yelled, waving her manicured hand dismissively. "We do not allow solicitors in this building. You need to leave before I call security." A few of the younger analysts standing nearby snickered. One of them nudged his friend and pointed. "Look at the old guy doing hand signals. He is probably asking for spare change." They laughed, a cruel, sharp sound that echoed off the marble walls. The old man's face flushed with frustration and deep humiliation. He dropped his hands to his sides, looking around the massive lobby, realizing he was surrounded by people who viewed him as a nuisance rather than a human being. Something inside me snapped. I knew exactly what it felt like to be looked right through, to be treated like garbage by people who thought they were inherently better than you. Without a second thought about my place at the bottom of the corporate ladder, I walked away from the elevator bank and approached the reception desk. "Excuse me," I said quietly but firmly, stepping between Brittany and the elderly man. I turned my back to the receptionist and faced the visitor. I raised my hands and carefully formed the gestures I had spent years mastering. I had learned American Sign Language in my 20s to communicate with my late grandmother after she lost her hearing. It was a beautiful, expressive language, and signing to this man immediately brought a wave of warm memories rushing back to me. "Hello," I signed, making sure my facial expressions matched my warm tone. "My name is Gwen. How can I help you today?" The transformation in the old man's demeanor was instantaneous. The tension melted from his shoulders and his eyes lit up with profound relief. He let out a long breath and quickly raised his hands to sign back to me. "Thank you." He signed, his gestures sharp and precise despite his age. "These people think I am a beggar. I am here for a meeting, but my phone battery died, and I cannot pull up my digital pass." I smiled at him warmly, signing back. I am so sorry about how you were just treated. Let us get this sorted out. Do you know who you are supposed to be meeting with? Before he could answer, Brittany slammed her hand on the desk. Gwen, what do you think you are doing? She snapped, her voice dripping with venom. Interns do not handle vagrants. Get him out of here before you both get thrown out. Mr. Pierce is in the building today, and if he sees this mess in his lobby, you are done. Jonathan Pierce was the CEO of Vanguard Investments. He was a notorious perfectionist, a man who fired executives for being 2 minutes late to a meeting. His name struck fear into the heart of every employee in the building. But looking at the vulnerable man in front of me, I simply did not care about Jonathan Pierce's legendary temper. He is not a vagrant, Brittany, I said aloud without turning around, keeping my focus entirely on the man. He is a guest. I turned my attention back to him and signed, Please excuse her ignorance. Who are you here to see? The old man gave me a small, knowing smile. He reached into the inner pocket of his faded cardigan and pulled out a solid black metal keycard. It was completely unbranded, devoid of the usual Vanguard logos or employee names. It was a card I had only heard rumors about, a Level 0 Master Access card granted only to the absolute highest tier of board members and silent partners. Brittany gasped loudly behind me. The snickering analyst suddenly fell dead silent. The old man looked at me, signed the words, "Thank you again," and then deliberately walked past the reception desk. He approached the private executive elevator, swiped the black metal card, and the doors slid open instantly. He stepped inside, gave me one final nod, and disappeared as the doors closed. The lobby was completely paralyzed. Brittany looked pale, staring at the empty space where the man had just been standing. I picked up my stack of reports, feeling a strange mix of confusion and satisfaction, and headed to my assigned cubicle in the basement analysis pit. I spent the next hour running financial models, trying to put the bizarre encounter out of my mind. I assumed the old man was perhaps an eccentric wealthy client or a retired founder. I told myself it did not matter. I had a mountain of work to finish if I wanted to keep my grueling underpaid position. But exactly 15 minutes later, heavy footsteps approached my cubicle. I looked up to see the imposing figure of the head of corporate security standing over my desk. He was a large, unsmiling man who rarely spoke to anyone below the executive floor. He did not ask for my name. He did not say hello. He simply tapped his thick finger on the edge of my desk. Gwen. He said, his voice a low rumble that made the other interns in the pit stop typing and stare. Leave your things here. Jonathan Pierce wants you in his office. Right now. My stomach plummeted. The CEO. The man who never spoke to interns, who operated from the penthouse suite like a god on Mount Olympus, had summoned me. I swallowed hard, my mind racing through worst-case scenarios as I stood up and followed the security guard toward the executive elevator. I thought my act of kindness had just cost me the only fragile foothold I had left in the world. I had absolutely no idea that walking into that office would change the trajectory of my entire life, arming me with a silent power so immense it would eventually bring my toxic family to their knees. The elevator ride to the top floor felt like a long march to the executioner's block. The heavy metal doors glided open to reveal the penthouse suite, a vast expanse of thick wool carpet, frosted glass, and panoramic views of the city skyline. The security guard left me at a set of towering double oak doors. I knocked once, took a deep breath, and walked inside. I was fully prepared to apologize, pack up my few belongings, and figure out how to pay my rent. But the scene inside the office made me freeze completely in my tracks. Jonathan Pierce, the ruthless CEO of Vanguard Investments. A man who regularly made seasoned executives cry during board meetings, was not sitting behind his massive mahogany desk. Instead, he was standing respectfully to the side, his posture rigid with absolute deference. Sitting in the plush leather CEO chair was the same elderly man from the lobby, still wearing his faded brown cardigan and thick glasses. He was drinking tea from a delicate porcelain cup. When I walked in, he set the cup down and smiled at me. "Gwen, take a seat," Jonathan said. His voice was not angry. It was cautious, almost nervous. I sat down in one of the sleek guest chairs, my hands folded tightly in my lap. Jonathan cleared his throat. I believe you have already met our founder and majority shareholder Elias Thorne. The name hit me like a physical blow. Everyone in the financial world knew the name Elias Thorne. He was a legendary angel investor, a self-made billionaire who had built Vanguard from the ground up before stepping back into the shadows decades ago. He was famously reclusive. People spent their entire careers hoping for a 5-minute meeting with him, and I had just defended him from a receptionist. Elias raised his hands. I watched intently as his fingers formed the familiar shapes of American Sign Language. You are the only person in this building who treated me like a human being today. He signed, his expression softening. Everyone else saw an old man in cheap clothes and treated me like trash. You saw a person who needed help. I signed back instinctively. It was the right thing to do, Mr. Thorne. Anyone should have done it. He shook his head, signing rapidly. But they did not. That is the problem with this company. I built Vanguard on integrity, but now it is filled with sharks and sycophants who only care about status. They are blinded by greed and superficial metrics. I need someone who can see clearly, someone who understands true value. Jonathan stepped forward and slid a thick manila folder across the desk toward me. Inside was a non-disclosure agreement and an employment contract. The numbers printed on the pages were absolutely staggering. Elias continued signing. I have a private portfolio of investment shadow funds that Vanguard manages off the books. I am getting too old to oversee every detail, and I refuse to hand control over to the arrogant children roaming these floors. I want you to manage my personal assets, Gwen. I stared at him in complete shock. Me? I signed back, my hands trembling slightly. I am just a 33-year-old intern. I do not even have a desk on the main floor. That is exactly why I want you. Elias signed, a spark of brilliant cunning in his eyes. You are invisible to them. They ignore you. They underestimate you. That makes you incredibly dangerous. You will remain an intern on paper. You will fetch coffee file reports and keep your head down, but in reality, you will be my personal proxy. You will have full executive clearance, direct access to my capital, and the ultimate power to authorize or kill any deal that crosses my desk. I looked down at the contract again. The base salary alone was more money than I had ever seen in my life, along with performance bonuses that could rival Jonathan Pierce's own compensation. But it was not the money that made my heart race. It was the power, the sheer terrifying, exhilarating power to move millions of dollars with a single keystroke. To be the invisible hand guiding the fate of the very people who looked down on me. I thought of my family. I thought of how they had stripped me of my dignity, how they had stolen my inheritance to fund their perfect golden child, and how they had cast me aside because I did not fit their superficial mold. They thought I was a failure. They thought I was nothing but a cautionary tale. This contract was my ticket to rewriting that narrative forever. Do we have a deal? Elias signed, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that belied his fragile appearance. I picked up the heavy gold pen resting next to the folder. The cool metal felt solid and reassuring in my grip. I did not hesitate for another second. I pressed the pen to the paper and signed my name on the dotted line, legally binding myself to Elias Thorne and establishing my silent empire. Jonathan took the folder, his demeanor shifting to treat me as an equal, perhaps even a superior. Welcome to the inner circle, Gwen, Jonathan said softly. Your security credentials will be updated by noon. You will have a direct encrypted line to Mr. Thorne. As far as the rest of the company is concerned, you are just fetching coffee. But you and I both know you are holding the keys to the kingdom. I stood up, feeling a surge of confidence I had not experienced in 5 long years. The broken, discarded woman who had begged her family for mercy was gone entirely. In her place stood the most powerful portfolio manager at Vanguard Investments, operating completely undetected. I signed a final thank you to Elias. He nodded, raising his teacup in a silent toast. I turned and walked out of the penthouse suite. The elevator ride down felt entirely different. I was no longer heading to the basement pit as a victim of circumstance. I was descending into the corporate jungle as an apex predator, hiding in plain sight, fully equipped, and simply waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I returned to my cramped cubicle in the basement analysis pit, slipping back into my role as the invisible intern. The other junior analysts were loudly complaining about their weekend plans, completely oblivious to the fact that the woman sitting 3 feet away from them now held enough financial leverage to buy and sell their entire careers. I kept my head down, opened my cheap company-issued laptop, and typed in the new encrypted login sequence Jonathan had provided. The screen blinked, shedding its standard corporate interface, and loaded a sleek, secure portal directly linked to Elias Thorne's private shadow funds. A single notification pinged. It was my very first assignment from Elias, a highly confidential buyout profile, requesting a massive $50 million capital injection. I clicked open the digital dossier. The bold logo at the top of the page seemed to burn through the screen. Apex Solutions. My blood ran completely cold. The air in my lungs vanished, replaced by a sudden, suffocating tightness. I knew that company. I knew it intimately because I had bled for it. I scrolled down with trembling fingers, landing on the executive summary. There were their faces smiling flawlessly in high-definition corporate headshots. Devin and Sienna. Devin was my brother-in-law, a charismatic, handsome African-American tech entrepreneur who knew how to charm investors with empty buzzwords and tailored suits. He had the kind of magnetic presence that made people empty their wallets before he even finished his pitch. Sitting right beside him in the corporate hierarchy was his wife, my younger sister Sienna. Sienna was the undeniable golden child of our family. She had always been the beautiful one, the socialite, the perfect daughter who played the game exactly how our parents wanted. While I spent my 20s studying market trends and caring for our ailing grandmother, Sienna was busy building a flawless aesthetic and marrying a man who promised to make our parents incredibly wealthy. Staring at their smiling faces on my screen, reading the arrogant projections they had submitted to Vanguard, the heavy, suffocating shadow of the past dragged me back to 5 years ago. It was a memory so painful, I had spent half a decade trying to bury it. Back then, Devin's first tech venture was on the verge of total collapse. He had grossly mismanaged funds overpromised on deliverables, and was drowning in toxic debt. My parents Cynthia and Richard were absolutely desperate to protect the family's elite social standing. They could not bear the humiliation of their golden child's husband declaring bankruptcy. It would ruin their carefully curated image at their country club dinners and exclusive charity galas. They needed cash, and they needed it immediately. They turned their predatory gaze on the only available asset left: my inheritance. When my grandmother passed away, she left a $2 million trust fund exclusively in my name. She knew exactly how my parents operated and wanted to ensure I was protected from their greed. But Cynthia and Richard were relentless. They cornered me in the formal dining room of our childhood home, launching a campaign of supreme emotional warfare. They told me that family requires sacrifice. They told me that if I truly loved them, I would sign the trust over to Devin's holding company as an emergency bridge loan. They promised it was only temporary, a mere formality to appease the creditors until the next funding round came through. When I hesitated, knowing the massive risk involved, the emotional manipulation turned vicious. Cynthia stood over me, her voice dripping with venom. She told me I was being selfish and hoarding money I did not even know how to use. Richard slammed his fists on the table, demanding to know why I insisted on destroying my sister's happiness. They wore me down over weeks of constant berating, making me feel like the villain in my own family. In a moment of sheer exhaustion and desperate longing for their approval, I finally broke. I signed the transfer documents, handing over every single penny of my $2 million inheritance to save Devin's company. The second the ink dried on those papers, their entire demeanor changed. The promises of repayment evaporated into thin air. Within weeks, the money was fully absorbed into Apex Solutions, effectively making my sister and her husband millionaires while leaving me with absolutely nothing. My parents had what they wanted. I was suddenly useless to them. The final blow came just a month later. I had lost my apartment because I had no safety net left. I arrived at my parents' house with a single suitcase, asking to stay in my old childhood bedroom just for a few weeks while I figured out my next steps. Cynthia opened the front door, blocking my entry. She looked me up and down, with an expression of pure unadulterated disgust. "You are not staying here," she said coldly. "Sienna and Devin are hosting important investors this weekend, and we simply cannot have you bringing down the mood." I begged her, explaining that I had nothing left, that I had given them everything I had. Sienna stood in the background, leaning against the staircase. She was wearing a brand new designer watch bought with my stolen money, smirking as she watched me plead. Richard stepped up behind my mother, his face hard and unforgiving. "You are nearly 30 years old," he snapped. "You are too old to be clinging to us, and frankly, you are useless to our family image. You have no career, no husband, and no ambition. We cannot have a failure living under our roof while your sister is building an empire. Grow up and figure it out on your own." They slammed the door in my face. I stood on the porch in the freezing rain, completely penniless, abandoned by the very people I had just bankrupted myself to save. They discarded me the moment my bank account hit zero. I snapped back to reality, the harsh fluorescent lights of the Vanguard basement pulling me out of the nightmare. I stared at the buyout profile for Apex Solutions on my encrypted screen. Devin was asking Vanguard for millions. They were flying high on the wealth they stole from me, completely unaware that their financial future was now sitting on the desk of the sister they threw away. Elias Thorne did not just give me a job. He had handed me the exact weapon I needed. My family thought they had destroyed me 5 years ago. They were about to find out that I did not just survive their betrayal. I weaponized it. An urgent calendar notification sliced through the quiet hum of the basement analysis pit. I minimized the classified Apex Solutions file and opened my email. The message was blasted to all junior staff. The executives from Apex Solutions had entered the building for their $50 million pitch. They were early. My floor manager, a stressed man named Todd, came sprinting down the aisle between our cubicles. He clapped his hands loudly, his face flushed with panic. "Listen up, everyone. The Apex team is in the lobby right now. Jonathan Pierce wants them treated like royalty before they head up. I need a coffee run immediately." Todd's eyes darted around the room, skipping over the younger analysts, who suddenly found their spreadsheets fascinating. His gaze landed squarely on me. "Gwen, you are up. 4 vanilla lattes, extra hot. Get them from the premium cafe across the street and bring them directly to the VIP waiting area. Do not make them wait." I stared at him for a single heavy second. A week ago, being treated like an errand boy by a middle manager would have sent a familiar, painful spike of humiliation through my chest. Today, it felt like a perfectly scripted opening act. I nodded silently, grabbed my cheap plastic intern badge, and walked out. The air outside was crisp as I crossed the street to the upscale cafe. As I waited for the barista to prepare the lattes, my mind raced. Devin and Sienna were actually here. They had walked right into my territory, completely blind to the trap waiting for them on the penthouse floor. They thought they were securing a $50 million lifeline from a faceless corporate machine. They had no idea the machine was currently waiting for their coffee. I picked up the tray holding the 4 steaming cups. My reflection caught in the glass doors of the Vanguard building. I wore a plain gray pencil skirt and a sensible blouse from a discount store. My blue intern lanyard hung around my neck, screaming my insignificance. I looked exactly like the failure my parents had declared me to be. It was the perfect camouflage. I swiped my badge at the security turnstile and stepped into the sprawling, sunlit expanse of the main lobby. The VIP waiting area was a raised platform furnished with white leather sofas and minimalist glass tables designed specifically to make guests feel pampered and intimidated. Devin stood near the edge of the platform, radiating the effortless magnetic arrogance that had fooled my parents into handing over my life savings. As an African-American tech founder in a predominantly white corporate landscape, he had weaponized his charm, turning every interaction into a calculated performance. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that fit him with razor-sharp precision. A platinum watch gleamed on his wrist every time he gestured. He was currently laughing loudly at a joke made by a junior executive, flashing a bright, disarming smile that masked the absolute financial rot hiding inside his company. Sitting on the white leather sofa directly behind him was my younger sister. Seeing Sienna in person after 5 years hit me with a visceral shock. She looked like she had walked straight out of a luxury lifestyle magazine. She wore a pristine white designer blazer draped casually over her shoulders. Her hair was blown out into perfect cascading waves. A massive diamond ring flashed on her finger as she scrolled through her phone with an air of profound boredom. Sitting on the glass table next to her was a limited edition designer handbag that cost more than my entire annual intern salary. That bag, that ring, that bespoke suit Devin was wearing, they were all bought with my grandmother's money. They were wearing my stolen inheritance. My grip on the cardboard tray tightened until the cardboard began to bend. The intense heat from the lattes seeped through the cups, burning my palms, but I barely registered the pain. A dark, furious energy coiled in the pit of my stomach. They looked so incredibly comfortable. They looked like they belonged in this world of wealth and power, while I was relegated to carrying their drinks. They had destroyed my life, cast me out into the freezing rain, and built a glittering empire on top of my financial ruins. I took a slow, measured breath. I let the burning sensation in my hands ground me to the present moment. I was not the terrified 28-year-old girl begging for a place to sleep anymore. I was Vanguard's top portfolio manager, the proxy for a billionaire and the executioner of their financial future. I began walking toward the VIP platform. My steps were slow and deliberate. The cold marble floor clicked softly beneath my sensible shoes. With every single step, I took the physical distance between us closed. 10 feet, 8 feet, 6 feet. I was ready. Sienna was still staring at her phone, her brow furrowed in irritation. Devin was wrapping up his conversation with the junior executive, clapping the man on the shoulder with practiced familiarity. Neither of them had noticed me yet. To them, I was just another faceless drone in a corporate uniform, a servant performing a menial task. I stepped onto the raised platform. The junior executive walked away, leaving Devin and Sienna completely alone for a brief moment before they would be escorted to the boardroom. I moved directly toward the glass table where Sienna rested her stolen luxury bag. My heart hammered against my ribs, a chaotic drumbeat of adrenaline and pure icy focus. Sienna sighed loudly, slapping her phone face down on the table. "Where is that intern with our coffee?" She complained, her voice carrying that familiar grating tone of utter entitlement. "We have a $50 million pitch in 10 minutes. I refuse to go in there uncoffeed." Devin turned around, adjusting his expensive silk tie. "Relax, babe. The junior guys are terrified of us. They are probably brewing the beans themselves to make sure it is perfect. We own this building today." I stepped right into their direct line of sight. "Your coffee," I said quietly, my voice slicing through their arrogant banter. Devin froze. His hands stopped mid-adjustment on his tie. Sienna slowly lifted her head from the white leather sofa. The annoyance on her face morphed instantly into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock as her eyes locked onto mine. The golden child and the charismatic fraudster were suddenly staring directly at the sister they had thrown away. The silence that fell over the VIP platform was absolute. For a moment, the bustling sounds of the Vanguard lobby faded into a dull hum, leaving only the sharp intake of breath from my sister. Sienna stared at my cheap gray skirt, the blue intern lanyard resting against my chest, and finally up to my face. The shock in her eyes rapidly dissolved, replaced by a slow, venomous smirk that I remembered all too well from our childhood. "Well, look who it is," Sienna said, her voice dripping with mock pity. "Devin, honey, do you see this? My big sister finally made it to Wall Street, and she is serving us coffee." Devin let out a short, incredulous laugh. He crossed his arms over his bespoke charcoal suit and shook his head. He looked at me as if I were a stain on the pristine marble floor. "I thought you were living in a shelter, Gwen?" he said, his tone loud enough to draw the attention of several Vanguard employees passing by. "I guess fetching lattes for executives is a step up from begging on the street. It is good to see you are finally learning your place in the world." I kept my expression completely blank. I did not let a single ounce of the fury boiling inside my chest show on my face. I stepped forward, holding the cardboard tray out toward them. "Your vanilla lattes," I said, my voice steady and professional. "Be careful. They are extremely hot. I extended the tray toward the glass table. Sienna stood up from the white leather sofa. She smoothed down her designer blazer, the one paid for by my stolen inheritance, and reached for the cup nearest to her. But she did not grab the cup. Instead, she locked her eyes directly onto mine, flashing a smile of pure malice. She flicked her wrist sharply, striking the bottom of the cardboard tray. The impact sent all 4 scalding lattes flying through the air. The heavy ceramic cups shattered against the glass table, sending a tidal wave of boiling brown liquid cascading directly onto me. The searing heat hit my stomach and soaked instantly through my cheap blouse and skirt, burning my skin. The coffee splashed down my legs and pooled around my sensible shoes. Beneath the ruined tray, the stack of financial projection reports I had been carrying slipped from my grasp, landing right in the middle of the dark, expanding puddle. The ink immediately began to bleed across the pages, completely destroying hours of my work. A collective gasp rippled through the lobby. Several junior analysts and a security guard stopped dead in their tracks, watching the spectacle unfold. My skin burned fiercely from the scalding liquid, but I refused to give my sister the satisfaction of hearing me cry out in pain. I stood completely still, coffee dripping from the hem of my skirt onto the polished floor. "Oh my goodness. I am so incredibly sorry," Sienna gasped, placing a hand over her mouth in a theatrical display of false horror. "I guess I am just so nervous about our $50 million meeting today. But honestly, Gwen, you really should learn how to balance a tray properly. It is the only job you actually have here. How do you expect to survive as an intern if you cannot even deliver coffee without making a massive mess?" She looked around at the Vanguard employees who were staring at us. She was playing the victim, casting me as the incompetent, clumsy servant who had ruined her morning. The sheer audacity of her performance was staggering, but it was exactly what I expected from the golden child. Devin let out a loud, theatrical sigh, shaking his head in exaggerated disappointment. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket and pulled out a sleek leather money clip. He peeled off a crisp $50 bill with deliberate slowness. An intern at 33, Devin mocked, his voice echoing clearly across the lobby. "That is just tragic. Here." He crumpled the $50 bill into a tight ball and tossed it directly at my coffee-soaked shoes. The green paper bounced off my toe and landed in the puddle of spilled lattes. "Buy yourself a new shirt, Gwen. Keep the change for your failed career. You clearly need it more than we do." The humiliation was designed to break me entirely. It was designed to make me scream, to make me lash out, to make security drag me out of the building in a hysterical fit. That was their goal. They wanted to prove to everyone and to themselves that I was exactly what our parents claimed I was. A failure, an embarrassment, a pathetic woman who could not handle the real world. But they did not know who they were dealing with anymore. They were looking at the ghost of the sister they had destroyed 5 years ago, not the architect of their impending financial doom. I looked down at the crumpled $50 bill, soaking up the spilled coffee. The physical pain from the burns on my legs was intense, but the icy calm settling over my mind was infinitely stronger. I slowly bent my knees, lowering myself toward the marble floor. I could feel the eyes of the entire Vanguard lobby burning into my back. They were watching a middle-aged intern grovel for scraps from the wealthy elite. As I knelt in the puddle of coffee, I reached into the right pocket of my ruined skirt. My fingers brushed against the solid, cold metal of the Level 0 Master Access card, the VIP key card to Elias Thorne's multi-billion-dollar private accounts. I gripped the card tightly, feeling its sharp edges dig into my palm. It was the physical manifestation of my invisible power. I picked up the soaking wet $50 bill. I squeezed the brown liquid out of the paper, folded it neatly, and slipped it into my pocket, right next to Elias Thorne's keycard. I stood back up, my posture perfectly straight, my face devoid of any emotion whatsoever. I looked at Sienna, whose smug smile faltered slightly at my absolute silence. I looked at Devin, whose arrogant posture shifted into a stance of slight unease. They were waiting for me to react, to give them the dramatic meltdown they desperately craved. I gave them absolutely nothing. I turned my back on them and walked away. I left the ruined reports and the shattered ceramic cups on the floor, My shoes squished with every step, and the scalding coffee continued to sting my skin, but I kept my head high. The crowd of Vanguard employees parted silently to let me through, their faces a mix of pity and shock. I walked straight past the reception desk and headed toward the basement elevators. I did not look back. I did not need to. The ultimate trap was already fully formed in my mind. Devon and Sienna had just handed me the final piece of motivation I needed to execute them flawlessly. They thought they had humiliated me, but all they had done was confirm that they deserved absolutely zero mercy. The $50 million meeting they were so desperately relying on was about to become the site of their financial execution. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the basement analysis pit. The stainless steel doors slid shut, cutting off the view of the lobby and the lingering stares of my coworkers. Alone in the descending car, I finally allowed a slow, dangerous smile to spread across my face. The pain of the burns faded into the background, completely overshadowed by the brilliant, intoxicating rush of anticipation. I had a deadline to meet, a portfolio to weaponize, and an empire of lies to burn straight to the ground. Let them enjoy their triumph in the lobby, I thought to myself as the elevator hummed downward. Let them believe they have won. It will make their total destruction inside that boardroom all the more devastating. The elevator hit the basement floor with a soft chime. I stepped out, ignored the whispers of my fellow interns, and walked straight to the restroom to clean the blistering red burns on my legs. I survived the rest of the workday in damp clothes, staring at my encrypted terminal, laying the digital tripwires for Apex Solutions. By the time I finally unlocked the door to my own apartment that evening, the adrenaline had faded into a deep, calculating focus. My apartment was small, a modest one-bedroom in Queens, but it was a sanctuary built entirely with my own hands. I changed into comfortable clothes, applied soothing burn ointment to the angry red marks Sienna had left on my skin, and sat at my kitchen island with a cup of warm tea. I opened my personal laptop to securely tunnel into the Vanguard network. I needed to verify the final details of Elias Thorne's trap. But before I could enter my credentials, my cell phone buzzed violently against the wooden countertop. I glanced at the screen. The caller ID displayed a name I had not seen illuminated on my phone in 5 long years. Cynthia. My mother. My first instinct, born from decades of emotional conditioning, was a sharp spike of anxiety. A cold sweat prickled at the back of my neck. 5 years ago, a call from my mother meant an impending lecture, a cruel comparison to Sienna, or a relentless demand for money. But as I stared at the glowing screen, the anxiety rapidly dissolved, replaced by a profound, icy calm. I was no longer the desperate daughter seeking her approval. I reached out and tapped the green button to accept the call. I did not say hello. I simply raised the phone to my ear and waited. "Gwen?" My mother's voice snapped through the speaker. It was sharp, impatient, and completely devoid of any maternal warmth. There was no greeting. There was no inquiry about how I was doing. There was certainly no apology for her golden child throwing scalding coffee on me just hours earlier. "I know you are there. I know you work at Vanguard." I remained silent, letting her uncomfortable pause stretch out. "Sienna told me what happened in the lobby today." Cynthia continued, her tone dripping with intense disapproval. "Honestly, Gwen, 33 years old and you are fetching coffee as a lowly intern. It is humiliating for this family. You always did have a knack for embarrassing us in public places. You provoked your sister and she was rightfully upset. You called me after 5 years of silence to critique my career choices and defend a physical assault," I asked. My voice was completely flat, a serene contrast to her aggressive energy. "Do not use that tone with me," she fired back instantly. "I am calling because your sister and Devon have a monumental presentation tomorrow. They are pitching the Vanguard Executive Board for a $50 million capital injection. This deal will secure our family's financial legacy for generations to come. It will elevate Devon's company to the top tier of the tech industry." "Your family's legacy," I corrected her quietly. "You made it explicitly clear I am not part of it when you threw me out on the street." Cynthia scoffed loudly into the receiver. "Do not be dramatic. We did what we had to do to push you toward independence. We could not coddle you forever." And now it seems Providence has put you exactly where we need you to be. I am giving you a chance to redeem yourself, Gwen. I leaned back in my chair. A chance to redeem myself. I repeated the words slowly, tasting the absolute absurdity of her delusion. She actually believed I was seeking redemption from the people who robbed me. Yes, Cynthia said, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial commanding register. Devon needs a guaranteed win tomorrow. The Vanguard board is notoriously brutal, and they evaluate pitches based on proprietary internal risk models. Since you are fetching coffee on the executive floors, you have physical access to the analyst pit. I want you to log into their system tonight. Find the internal valuation reports and the exact risk assessment rubrics Vanguard intends to use for Apex Solutions. You will download those files and email them directly to Devon so he can manipulate his pitch data to match their exact expectations. I sat in my quiet apartment, genuinely marveling at her audacity. She was explicitly demanding that I commit corporate espionage. She wanted me to risk federal prison to help the brother-in-law who had bankrupted me and the sister who had just humiliated me. You want me to steal highly confidential financial documents, I stated plainly, ensuring her demand was articulated without any ambiguity. You want me to commit fraud. Stop using such ugly words, Cynthia hissed. It is not stealing. It is securing a strategic advantage for your own flesh and blood. This is your chance to finally be useful to this family. You owe us for the years we put a roof over your head. I owed them nothing. The $2 million of my inheritance they drained into Devon's failing startup more than covered my childhood room and board. I felt a laugh rising in my throat, but I suppressed it. I am not going to do that, I replied. My voice was a frozen blade. I will not compromise my integrity, and I certainly will not commit a felony to save Devon's fraudulent company. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. For a moment, I thought the call had dropped. Then my mother's voice returned, dropping several octaves into a chilling, venomous whisper. You listen to me, you ungrateful little wretch. You will do exactly as I say. Do this for your sister, or I will personally make sure you are blacklisted from Wall Street. I know people in this city. I know executives who play golf with Jonathan Pierce. I will make one phone call and tell them you are a thief, a liar, and mentally unstable. You will never work in finance again. You will be back to sleeping on couches before the week is over. Her threat was designed to strike absolute terror into my heart. She genuinely believed I was a fragile, desperate intern clinging to the bottom rung of the corporate ladder. She thought her social connections could crush me with a single whisper. I let out a slow, deliberate breath. The cool air filled my lungs, bringing a profound sense of clarity. Go ahead, I said, my words dripping with absolute certainty. Call Jonathan Pierce. Tell him whatever you want. But mark my words, Cynthia. Tomorrow, when Devon and Sienna walk into that boardroom, they are going to face a reality they never saw coming. You wanted me to be useful to this family. I promise you by tomorrow afternoon I will give this family exactly what it deserves. I ended the call before she could scream another threat. I set the phone down on the kitchen counter and stared at the black screen. My mother had just declared total war. By refusing her extortion, I knew she would immediately contact Devon and Sienna to arrange a brutal retaliation. They would use whatever leverage they had to destroy the disobedient intern before the sun came up. They thought they were hunting a rabbit. They had absolutely no idea they had just stepped into the jaws of a lion. I opened my encrypted laptop, accessed Elias Thorne's shadow accounts, and began preparing the final nails for their financial coffin. The game was no longer about survival. It was about execution. The morning sun barely pierced the gray clouds over Manhattan as I walked into the Vanguard Investments building. I swiped my blue intern badge at the security turnstiles, keeping my expression perfectly neutral. Today was the day of the massive $50 million pitch. The entire building hummed with electric anticipation, but down in the basement analysis pit, the air felt strangely suffocating. I set my bag down at my cramped cubicle and turned on my company-issued computer. My mother had promised a brutal retaliation for my refusal to play the obedient criminal daughter. I knew Cynthia and Devon would not take my defiance lightly, but I severely underestimated the sheer speed and ruthlessness of their counterattack. Devon was a man who built his entire life on manipulation. He possessed a dangerous weaponized charisma that allowed him to bypass protocol and buy loyalty. And he had used that exact charm, along with a massive infusion of my stolen inheritance, to bribe the one man who had direct access to my daily workflow, Todd, my floor manager. As my computer booted up, I noticed Todd standing at the end of the aisle. He was sweating slightly, shifting his weight from foot to foot, his eyes darting between my cubicle and his tablet. He looked like a man who had just sold his soul and was terrified of the immediate consequences. I ignored him, typing in my standard intern login credentials to check my mundane daily tasks. I had to maintain my cover story until the board meeting that afternoon. But the moment my desktop loaded, a chilling anomaly appeared on the screen. There was a massive encrypted folder sitting directly in the center of my desktop, bypassing all the standard firewall protocols. The file name was a string of alphanumeric codes, but the metadata tag was glaringly obvious. It was labeled as restricted Tier 1 client data. My financial training kicked in instantly. These were unreleased merger and acquisition documents, highly classified insider secrets that only senior partners were legally allowed to view. Having these files on an intern workstation was not just a fireable offense, it was a severe federal crime. My hands hovered over the keyboard. I immediately recognized the digital footprint. Someone had remotely pushed this folder onto my local drive overnight. Devon and Todd had orchestrated a flawless frame-up. They were planting evidence of corporate espionage on my computer, creating a digital trail that made it look like I was stealing and selling Vanguard insider secrets to the black market. It was Cynthia's threat coming to life in real time. They were going to ensure I was blacklisted from Wall Street and sent straight to federal prison. Before I could hit the delete key or initiate a system wipe, my entire screen froze. The soft blue glow of the desktop vanished, replaced by a harsh, glaring red screen. Bold white letters flashed across the monitor. Network lockdown. Unauthorized access detected. The sound of heavy, synchronized footsteps echoed through the basement. I turned my chair around to see three imposing corporate security officers marching down the narrow aisle, heading straight for my cubicle. Todd was leading them, his earlier nervousness now masked by a poorly executed look of self-righteous indignation. The typing in the analysis pit stopped completely. Dozens of junior analysts popped their heads up over the cubicle dividers, their eyes wide with morbid curiosity. "Step away from the keyboard, Gwen," the lead security officer commanded, his hand resting near his utility belt. "Do not touch the mouse." I stood up slowly, raising my hands to show I was complying. I kept my face entirely devoid of panic. "What is the meaning of this?" "Todd," I asked, my voice calm and steady, projecting across the silent room. "Do not play dumb with me," Todd spat, pointing an accusing finger at my chest. He was projecting his voice, making absolutely sure every single person in the basement heard his scripted lines. "The IT department just flagged a massive data breach originating from your terminal. You downloaded classified merger documents, Gwen. We have the digital logs showing you were attempting to route them to an external unsecured server. You are stealing corporate secrets." Gasps rippled through the bullpen. The junior analysts began whispering frantically to one another. Corporate espionage was the ultimate sin at Vanguard. People went to federal prison for decades for exactly this type of crime. Devon had executed his plan perfectly. He used Todd to plant the files, triggered the security alert, and ensured I was publicly humiliated and arrested just hours before his crucial pitch. With me locked away in a holding cell facing felony charges, I would be completely neutralized. I could not interfere with his $50 million fraud. "Security, escort her off the floor immediately," Todd ordered, puffing out his chest. "Mr. Pierce will be informed of this betrayal. The authorities are being contacted as we speak." The guards stepped forward, grabbing me roughly by the arms. They did not give me a chance to grab my bag or my coat. They marched me down the main aisle, parading me past my peers like a convicted criminal. The stares of the other interns burned into my skin. I could hear their hushed judgments calling me a thief, A failure, exactly the narrative my mother had designed for me. I did not struggle. I walked with my back straight and my head held high. I knew that resisting would only validate their false narrative. The guards led me to the private security elevators, swiping us up to a restricted floor that most employees never saw. The doors opened to a sterile, windowless corridor lined with heavy steel doors. They pushed me into a small holding room containing nothing but a metal table and two bolted chairs. The harsh fluorescent lighting buzzed overhead, casting a sickly pallor over the gray walls. Todd stepped into the doorway before the guards closed it. He looked down at me with a sickeningly smug grin. "You really thought you could pull one over on Vanguard," he sneered. "You are done, Gwen. The feds will be here within the hour. You are looking at 20 years for wire fraud and insider trading. You threw your life away." He stepped back and the heavy steel door slammed shut. The magnetic lock engaged with a loud final click. I was entirely alone in the windowless room. The silence was absolute. To anyone else, this would be the end. A 33-year-old intern framed by her own family, locked in a corporate cell awaiting federal arrest. Devin and Cynthia undoubtedly thought they had won. They believed they had permanently silenced the scapegoat, clearing the path for the golden child to secure her $50 million prize. But as I sat down in the cold metal chair, a slow, predatory smile spread across my face. They had plotted a brilliant, ruthless trap for an ordinary intern, but they forgot one massive critical detail. I was not an ordinary intern. By framing me and locking me in this room, Devin had just triggered the highest level security protocol in the Vanguard network. He had inadvertently drawn the direct, unfiltered attention of the very man he was trying to steal from. My family thought they had buried me in the dark. They had no idea they had just handed me the match to light the entire building on fire. The cold metal chair seeped a chilling reality into my bones, but my mind was already 10 steps ahead of Devin's pathetic trap. The digital alarm I had embedded within Elias Thorne's private network architecture was specifically designed to alert the highest authority the moment an unauthorized packet hit my terminal. Devin and Todd thought they were dropping a bomb on an unprotected intern. They had actually tripped a silent wire that bypassed every middle manager in the building and went straight to the penthouse. 15 minutes passed in the sterile silence of the holding room. I did not pace. I did not sweat. I simply waited. Suddenly, the heavy magnetic lock disengaged with a sharp mechanical thud. The steel door swung open. Todd stood in the hallway, his chest puffed out, ready to deliver his final gloating monologue before handing me over to federal authorities. But before he could even open his mouth, a towering figure stepped right past him, shoving Todd backward into the corridor with a brutal, unceremonious force. It was Jonathan Pierce. The CEO of Vanguard Investments did not look like a man arriving to fire an intern. He looked like a predator whose territory had just been violated. He stepped into the holding room and slammed the heavy steel door shut, right in Todd's bewildered face, locking the corrupt floor manager outside. Jonathan did not say a single word to me. He walked directly to the metal table, set down a sleek military-grade encrypted tablet, and flipped open the protective casing. The screen flickered to life, establishing a secure, untraceable connection. Sitting in his private study on the other side of the city, framed by towering bookshelves and the soft glow of a desk lamp, was Elias Thorne. The billionaire investor looked through the camera lens, his expression a mask of cold, calculated fury. He raised his hands and began to sign in crisp, sharp gestures. "Are you unharmed, Gwen?" He signed, his eyes piercing through the digital connection. I raised my hands, keeping my gestures perfectly steady. "I am fine, Mr. Thorne. Just waiting for the dust to settle." Elias gave a brief, grim nod. He signed rapidly, translating his absolute disgust for the situation. Jonathan and I were monitoring the network logs the moment that encrypted folder hit your drive. Whoever executed this frame-up is profoundly arrogant and astonishingly stupid. The digital signature was routed through a proxy, but they left a gaping hole in their metadata. It traces straight back to your floor manager. Todd was communicating with an external IP address belonging to Apex Solutions all morning. Jonathan leaned against the concrete wall, crossing his arms. Your brother-in-law Devon is playing a very dangerous game, he said, his voice echoing in the small room. He paid off Todd to plant those classified files. They wanted you detained and stripped of your credentials right before their $50 million pitch this afternoon. Devon clearly views you as a threat even if he only sees you as an intern. I watched Elias on the screen. Devon knows I am thorough, I signed back. 5 years ago, I warned my parents that his financial models were built on sand. They punished me for it, but Devon never forgot that I was the only one who saw through his charismatic facade. He panicked when he saw me in the lobby today. This frame-up was a desperate, sloppy attempt to remove a variable he could not control. Elias leaned closer to the camera. His hands moved with a lethal, terrifying grace. Desperation breeds fatal mistakes, he signed. Devon and your sister came to my company to steal $50 million. They corrupted one of my managers to silence my proxy. I do not tolerate thieves, and I absolutely do not tolerate anyone attacking my people. Jonathan stepped forward, tapping a few commands onto the tablet screen. The video feed of Elias shrank to the corner, and a new, highly classified interface filled the display. It was a solid black screen with a single pulsing red prompt demanding a biometric scan. I am not firing you, Gwen. Elias signed, a fierce, brilliant light sparking behind his thick glasses. I am taking the leash off entirely. Jonathan looked down at me. That is the Vanguard Shadow Ledger, he explained, his tone dropping to a hushed, reverent whisper. It is our black market debt acquisition platform. We use it to anonymously monitor, absorb, and control toxic debt across global markets. Only 3 people in this entire hemisphere have access to it. As of this exact second, you are the 4th. I stared at the black screen. This was not just a tool. It was a financial weapon of mass destruction. It allowed the user to bypass regulatory red tape, peer into the darkest corners of any corporate entity, and purchase their debt for pennies on the dollar through untraceable shell corporations. I am granting you Level 1 executive clearance. Elias signed, his gestures sharp and commanding. I want you to tear Apex Solutions apart. Dig into their actual financial health. I want to know where every single stolen dollar went. Find their toxic assets, find their hidden liabilities, and find the rot that Devon is so desperately trying to cover up with this $50 million pitch. I reached out and placed my face near the tablet scanner. A red beam swept across my eye, verifying my biometric data. The system unlocked, flooding the screen with cascading streams of raw, unfiltered global market data. You have the green light, Gwen, Jonathan said, pulling up a chair and sitting across from me. No oversight, no limits. You have the full weight of the Thorn estate backing your terminal. Rip them to shreds. I looked back at Elias on the screen. My hands moved with absolute predatory certainty. I will not just find the rot, Mr. Thorn, I signed. I will own it. Elias smiled, a terrifying expression that promised absolute ruin for his enemies. Happy hunting, he signed, cutting the video feed. I turned my attention entirely to the sleek tablet. The cold, windowless holding room was no longer a prison. It was a war room. With Level 1 clearance coursing through my fingertips, I bypassed the superficial financial reports Devon had submitted to the Vanguard board. I went straight for the jugular, initiating a deep dive into the offshore accounts and hidden ledgers of Apex Solutions. I began executing search queries through the Shadow Ledger, watching as the encrypted firewalls protecting Devon's company dissolved under Elias Thorne's override codes. My fingers flew across the digital keyboard, pulling bank statements, hidden loan agreements, and leveraged assets that Devon had intentionally scrubbed from the official Vanguard submission. The sheer volume of financial deception was staggering, but I was not intimidated. I was methodical. I cataloged every lie, every manipulated projection, and every stolen fund. They thought they had buried me in this concrete room to silence me forever. Instead, they had given me the exact quiet isolation I needed to orchestrate their total financial annihilation. The $50 million prize they were celebrating in the lobby was already a phantom. Now it was just a matter of waiting for the presentation to begin. Jonathan Pierce pulled his personal phone from his breast pocket and tapped out a rapid message. He looked up at me, the harsh fluorescent light of the holding room reflecting off his sharp features. I just informed the executive board that a critical compliance review requires us to push the Apex Solutions presentation to tomorrow morning, he said, his voice echoing slightly against the concrete walls. Devin and your sister are currently being escorted out of the lobby by security. They were told it is a standard scheduling conflict. They bought the lie completely. Jonathan gestured toward the heavy steel door. You cannot work in this cell. I have secured a private suite on the executive floor. Take the night, Gwen. Dig up every single lie they have buried. I nodded, gathering the encrypted tablet. The transition from a falsely accused intern in a basement holding cell to a shadow operative in a penthouse suite happened in a matter of minutes. Jonathan led me through a series of private corridors and biometric checkpoints until we reached a sprawling glass-walled office that overlooked the glittering Manhattan skyline. He left me alone with a pot of black coffee and a direct, unmonitored connection to the Vanguard shadow ledger. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the city lights flared to life outside the window, I initiated my deep dive into the financial soul of Apex Solutions. The initial files Devin had submitted to our board were a masterpiece of corporate fiction. On the surface, the company looked like a thriving tech startup with exponential year-over-year growth, massive user acquisition, and a revolutionary algorithm poised to disrupt the market. But with Elias Thorne's clearance coursing through my terminal, I bypassed the superficial spreadsheets and drove straight into their raw banking data. It took me less than an hour to find the first crack in the foundation. Devin claimed his revenue streams were generated by highly lucrative enterprise contracts. But when I traced the routing numbers attached to his largest clients, the money was not coming from legitimate tech corporations. The funds were cycling through a convoluted web of offshore shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands and Delaware. Devin was engaging in classic round-tripping. He was taking out massive high-interest loans, routing the cash through his fake clients, and registering the borrowed money as clean organic revenue. I drank my coffee, my eyes scanning lines of code and transaction histories as the night deepened. The deeper I dug into the encrypted ledgers, the more the putrid reality of Devin's operation revealed itself. He had not built a tech firm at all. He had built a highly sophisticated glorified Ponzi scheme. 5 years ago, when my parents forced me to sign over my $2 million inheritance to save his failing startup, Devin did not use a single cent of that money for research or development. The ledger showed exactly where my grandmother's money went. He used it to pay off his most aggressive early investors, buying their silence and creating a false track record of successful returns. Once those investors were satisfied, they vouched for him, allowing him to attract a second, much larger wave of venture capital. But a Ponzi scheme requires a constant influx of fresh cash to survive, and Devin was bleeding money faster than he could steal it. I opened the expense accounts linked to his personal holding company. My stomach turned as the numbers populated on my screen. While Devin was shuffling fraudulent loans to keep the business afloat, my sister Sienna was treating the company coffers like her personal piggy bank. There were millions of dollars classified under vague operational expenses that I quickly decoded. I found invoices for the bespoke charcoal suit Devin wore in the lobby, the massive diamond ring flashing on Sienna's finger, and the luxury penthouse my parents had recently claimed they bought themselves. The designer wardrobes, the luxury vehicles, the lavish vacations to Europe, and the exorbitant country club fees my parents enjoyed were all there. All of it was financed by draining the startup's capital and taking out highly toxic, unregulated mezzanine debt. They were living like royalty while their financial house burned to the ground. The final devastating piece of the puzzle clicked into place around 3 in the morning. I uncovered a heavily encrypted folder hidden deep within a subsidiary server. It contained the master ledger of Devin's actual liabilities. The number glowed in stark red digits on my screen. $15 million. Apex Solutions was hiding $15 million in immediate, highly toxic debt. The loans were structured with brutal, predatory interest rates, and were backed by aggressive private equity sharks who were demanding immediate repayment. Devon had used his home, the company's servers, and my parents' suburban estate as collateral to secure these shadow loans. He was completely out of time. His creditors were circling ready to dismantle his life and seize every asset my family owned. If Devon failed to secure the $50 million from Vanguard, the private equity sharks would legally evict my parents and leave Sienna penniless. The $50 million pitch to Vanguard was not a capital injection for market expansion. It was a desperate, panicked bailout. Devon intended to use Vanguard's money to secretly pay off the $15 million toxic debt siphon, another $10 million into his personal offshore accounts to maintain Sienna's lavish lifestyle, and leave Vanguard holding the bag when the hollow shell of Apex Solutions inevitably collapsed. He was trying to do to Vanguard exactly what he had done to me 5 years ago. He was trying to rob them blind and walk away smiling. A cold, profound sense of vindication washed over me. I spent the remaining hours of the night meticulously compiling every single piece of evidence. I downloaded the offshore routing numbers, the fraudulent revenue logs, and the brutal reality of the $15 million toxic debt. I organized the data into a flawless, undeniable portfolio. I was not just building a defense against the corporate espionage charges they tried to frame me with. I was constructing the perfect financial guillotine for my brother-in-law. I sat back down in the plush leather chair of the executive suite and pulled the encrypted tablet closer. The shadow ledger was still open, its black screen pulsing with global market feeds. Elias Thorne had not just given me the clearance to look at the data. He had given me the authority to deploy his capital. He wanted me to tear Apex Solutions apart, and I intended to do exactly that by becoming the master of their debt. Devon owed $15 million to a syndicate of ruthless private equity firms. These were aggressive, predatory lenders who specialized in funding desperate startups at exorbitant interest rates, fully expecting them to fail so they could strip and liquidate the collateral. But even predators get nervous when a borrower stops making payments. Devon was drowning, and his creditors knew it. The debt was becoming toxic on their own balance sheets. They were itching to offload it before Apex Solutions officially collapsed and forced them into a lengthy, messy bankruptcy proceeding. I opened the acquisition portal within the shadow ledger. My fingers flew across the glass keyboard, initiating the creation of 3 distinct, untraceable shell companies. I registered the first in Delaware, the second in Luxembourg, and the third in the Cayman Islands. By nesting these entities inside one another and routing them through Vanguard's elite corporate structure, I completely masked my identity. To the outside world, this looked like a routine high-level corporate debt restructuring executed by an anonymous hedge fund. With my ghost entities fully established, I targeted the primary private equity firm holding the largest chunk of Devon's debt. It was a ruthless outfit based in Chicago, holding $10 million of his outstanding loans. I drafted an automated encrypted offer using the Shadow Ledger's proprietary trading algorithms. I offered to purchase the toxic debt for 60 cents on the dollar. It was a massive loss for them, but it provided immediate liquidity for an asset they already considered dead. I hit send. The digital offer vanished into the network. The silence in the penthouse office felt heavy as I waited for a response. The digital clock on the corner of my screen ticked forward. 5:15 in the morning. 5:20. My heart pounded a steady, relentless rhythm against my ribs. This was the most dangerous, exhilarating financial maneuver of my entire life. If the Chicago firm hesitated, the entire strategy would stall. At 5:28, the screen flashed green. Accepted. A sharp breath escaped my lungs. I immediately authorized the wire transfer, pulling the funds directly from Elias Thorne's designated shadow accounts. The capital flowed through the encrypted channels, bypassing standard banking delays. Within seconds, the clearinghouse validated the transaction. I had just acquired $10 million of my brother-in-law's debt. I did not stop to celebrate. I immediately pivoted to the remaining $5 million held by 2 smaller boutique investment firms in New York. They were even more desperate for liquidity than the Chicago syndicate. I offered them 50 cents on the dollar. The digital negotiations were ruthless and brief. They tried to counteroffer, but I utilized Vanguard's aggressive trading bots to flood their system with hard deadlines, creating an illusion of intense market volatility. They panicked and accepted my terms. By 6:15 in this morning, the final wire transfers cleared. I leaned forward, my eyes scanning the acquisition summaries populating on the black screen. The digital paperwork finalized, locking the contracts into an immutable blockchain ledger. I opened the master file containing the collateral agreements tied to those newly acquired loans. The legal language was ironclad, drafted by predatory lawyers to ensure absolute compliance. Reading through the clauses was like reading the terms of my family's surrender. Devon had leveraged absolutely everything to secure that $15 million in a desperate bid to maintain his illusion of wealth. The servers and intellectual property of Apex Solutions were listed as primary collateral. The luxury penthouse where Devon and Sienna hosted their lavish dinner parties was listed as secondary collateral. And buried on page 42 was the most satisfying detail of all. My parents had co-signed the final $5 million loan, using their sprawling, heavily mortgaged suburban estate as the ultimate guarantee. Every designer suit Devon wore, every diamond ring Sienna flaunted, and every expensive country club dinner my parents enjoyed was financed by this exact debt. And now I held the master key to all of it. I was no longer an intern fetching coffee. I was legally the majority debt holder of Apex Solutions. I was the landlord of my sister's penthouse. I was the entity holding the deed to my parents' home. The sun rose higher, casting brilliant rays of gold and orange across the Manhattan skyline. The city below was waking up, completely oblivious to the massive shift in power that had just occurred in this silent, glass-walled room. I closed the collateral files and neatly stacked the digital evidence of Devon's fraud alongside my newly minted ownership contracts. A massive, electrifying rush of anticipation surged through my veins. The trap was perfectly constructed, fully armed, and inescapable. Devon and Sienna were going to walk into the Vanguard boardroom at 10 o'clock this morning, expecting to secure a $50 million lifeline. They expected to look across the mahogany table and see a room full of gullible investors ready to fund their extravagant, fraudulent lifestyle. Instead, they were going to look across that table and see the sister they had discarded. They were going to face the woman whose inheritance they stole, whose career they tried to destroy, and whose dignity they tried to crush in the lobby just yesterday. They thought they owned the world. They were about to find out that I owned them. At exactly 9:45 that morning, the heavy glass doors of the Vanguard executive boardroom swung open. I stood in the adjacent observation suite, separated from the main conference table by a wall of tinted soundproof glass. The observation room was completely dark, acting as a one-way mirror. I could see and hear everything happening inside the boardroom through the secure audio feed. But to anyone sitting at the mahogany table, the glass simply reflected their own faces back at them. I watched as Devon and Sienna strutted into the room. They moved with an unbearable manufactured confidence. Devon adjusted his bespoke suit jacket, flashing a brilliant, perfectly rehearsed smile at the junior executives who were arranging the briefing folders. Sienna walked 2 steps behind him, playing the role of the supportive, glamorous co-founder. She clutched a sleek leather portfolio, her designer heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. They looked exactly like the visionary tech disruptors they were desperately pretending to be. They had absolutely no idea that their entire financial existence had been erased from the global ledger just 4 hours earlier. Jonathan Pierce walked in moments later, followed by a handful of senior board members. The room settled into a tense, professional silence. Jonathan took his seat at the head of the table. He did not look toward the dark glass where I was standing, but I knew he was acutely aware of my presence. The trap was officially set. Devon wasted no time. He stood at the front of the room, dimmed the overhead lights, and activated the massive presentation screen. The Apex Solutions logo flashed across the wall, slick and imposing. "Thank you for having us, gentlemen," Devon began, his voice smooth and commanding. "Today we are not just presenting a software platform, we are presenting the future of predictive market analysis." Apex Solutions has developed a proprietary algorithm that anticipates volatile market shifts with 94% accuracy. We are here to offer Vanguard the exclusive opportunity to scale this technology globally. A $50 million capital injection will allow us to dominate the sector before our competitors even understand the math. Devin clicked a button on his remote. The screen transitioned to a complex web of data points forecasting models and core algorithmic architecture. He began to walk the board through the underlying mathematics of his supposed technological miracle. In the dark observation room, I stepped closer to the glass. My eyes locked onto the glowing numbers and formulas displayed on the massive screen. A sudden violent jolt went through my entire body. A sickening wave of recognition crashed over me, freezing the breath in my lungs. I knew those formulas. I knew the specific unconventional variables used to calculate the risk thresholds. I knew the exact sequencing of the predictive loops. It was not generic tech jargon. It was not a brilliant new innovation coded by a team of expensive engineers. It was my work. My mind violently snapped back to 5 years ago, to the months before my family completely destroyed my life. I had been working on a complex financial thesis, an experimental predictive algorithm designed to identify subtle inefficiencies in volatile markets. I had spent countless sleepless nights hunched over my laptop at the kitchen table of my parents' house, pouring my entire intellect into that research. It was my passion project, my brilliant concept that I hoped would one day launch my career on Wall Street. When my parents forced me to sign away my $2 million inheritance, I was utterly broken. When they kicked me out of the house into the freezing rain, I grabbed my bags in a blind panic. I had left my primary laptop on the desk in my childhood bedroom. When I finally saved enough money to buy a cheap replacement computer weeks later, I assumed my research was simply lost, left behind in a house I could never return to. I was completely wrong. It was not lost. It was stolen. I stared through the glass at Sienna, who was nodding proudly as Devin explained the mechanics of the algorithm. She had stolen my laptop. She had taken my proprietary research, handed it over to her failing husband, and they had slapped the Apex Solutions logo on my genius. They did not just steal my $2 million to pay off their early investors. They stole my intellect to secure their next massive payday. The sheer magnitude of their violation was breathtaking. They had built their entire identity as tech innovators on the back of my brain. They were standing in a room full of Wall Street billionaires begging for $50 million, using the exact work of the sister they had deemed too useless and ugly to represent their family. A hot, searing fury ignited in my chest, burning away any lingering shreds of familial loyalty I might have unconsciously harbored. Devin clicked to the next slide, pointing confidently at a series of projected growth charts. He was using all the right corporate buzzwords, speaking with undeniable conviction. But as I listened to him attempt to explain the deep architecture of the code, a sharp predatory realization pierced through my anger. Devin was reading a script. He had memorized the talking points and the high-level summaries, but he did not actually understand the underlying mathematics. He was a salesman reciting a pitch deck. He had no idea how the engine actually worked. More importantly, he had absolutely no idea that the algorithm he was presenting was functionally incomplete. 5 years ago, when I was writing that thesis, I had discovered a massive catastrophic vulnerability in the risk assessment loop. Under certain market stress conditions, the algorithm would create a feedback loop, falsely projecting astronomical profits while actually blinding the user to massive compounding losses. I had isolated the flaw and created a patch, but I had intentionally kept the corrected code in a separate encrypted notebook. The files Sienna stole from my laptop contained the original fatally flawed version of the software. Devin had built his entire company around a ticking time bomb. The $15 million in toxic debt he was secretly hiding was not just the result of bad management. It was the direct result of him relying on an algorithm that was actively destroying his capital. He had used my incomplete math to make his trades, and it had bankrupted him. Now he was trying to sell that exact same ticking time bomb to Vanguard Investments for $50 million. I placed my hands flat against the cold glass of the observation window. The anger evaporated entirely, replaced by a cold, calculating euphoria. Devon and Sienna were not just walking into a trap. They had built the trap themselves, armed it with their own greed, and handed the detonator directly to me. Devon concluded his presentation with a dramatic pause, letting the projected revenue numbers burn into the minds of the board members. "We are asking for a $50 million commitment today," Devon said, placing his hands firmly on the conference table. "In return, Vanguard will own the exclusive rights to the most powerful financial engine on the market. We are offering you the future." Jonathan Pierce leaned back in his chair, his face an impenetrable mask. He slowly turned his head, looking straight at the tinted glass where he knew I was watching. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was time. The presentation was over. The execution was about to begin. I turned away from the glass, my heart beating with the steady, calm rhythm of absolute certainty, and walked toward the door that led directly into the boardroom. I stepped out of the darkened observation room and into the brightly lit executive hallway. The heavy door clicked shut behind me, sealing away the quiet sanctuary, where I had just uncovered the ultimate depth of my family's betrayal. My heart beat with a slow, powerful rhythm. I was no longer operating on anger or sorrow. I was operating on absolute cold precision. To make my entrance into the boardroom seamless, I needed to maintain my cover for just a few more minutes. A catering cart sat neatly against the marble wall, prepped for the executives inside. I picked up a polished silver tray, holding several crystal water glasses and a pitcher of ice water. The weight of the tray grounded me. It was the perfect prop. To anyone looking, I was just the lowly intern tasked with keeping the executives hydrated. I took a step towards the towering mahogany doors of the boardroom, but the soft chime of the private VIP elevator echoing down the corridor stopped me in my tracks. The polished steel doors slid open, and my parents stepped out onto the executive floor. Cynthia and Richard walked with an air of staggering entitlement, projecting a manufactured aura of generational wealth that they no longer actually possessed. My father wore a sharp, custom-tailored navy suit, adjusting his cuffs with the arrogant swagger of a man who believed he was about to secure a $50 million victory. My mother stepped out beside him, dripping in offensive luxury. She wore a pristine emerald green dress, a strand of pearls resting against her collarbone, and carried a designer clutch that I knew for a fact was purchased with the mezzanine debt Devon had fraudulently secured. They had arrived for the victory lap. It was customary in these high-stakes corporate deals for the founder's inner circle to be brought in during the final phase of the meeting, ready to pop champagne and celebrate the signing of the term sheet. They were here to watch their golden child Sienna and their brilliant son-in-law Devon be crowned as Silicon Valley royalty. They expected to walk into a room full of applause and staggering wealth. They had absolutely no idea they were walking directly into a financial slaughterhouse. I stood near the catering cart holding the silver tray of water glasses, watching them interact with the executive floor receptionist. My mother spoke to the young woman with dismissive condescension, waving her hand, as if the receptionist were an annoying insect. My father checked his platinum watch impatiently, demanding to be escorted to the boardroom immediately. Then my mother turned her head. Her eyes swept across the hallway and locked entirely onto me. The haughty, impatient expression on her face vanished instantly, replaced by a sudden violent flash of panic and rage. She whispered something sharply to my father. He looked up, his jaw clenching the moment he saw me in my cheap intern uniform, holding a tray of water like a servant. Cynthia did not hesitate. She left the reception desk and marched rapidly down the corridor toward me, her designer heels clicking aggressively against the marble floor. She closed the distance between us in seconds, her face twisting into a mask of pure venom. Before I could even speak, she lunged forward and physically grabbed my left arm. Her manicured nails dug viciously through the thin fabric of my blouse, pinching my skin with genuine malice. She yanked me roughly toward the wall, pulling me out of the direct line of sight of the receptionist. "What in the world are you doing up here?" she hissed, her voice a low, furious whisper, designed to avoid drawing attention. "I thought Todd had you escorted out of the building. We were assured you were being handled by corporate security and locked in a holding cell." I looked down at her hand gripping my arm, then back up to her face. I kept my expression entirely blank, revealing absolutely none of the power I held. I was reassigned to boardroom duty, I said simply, my voice completely devoid of emotion. My father stepped up behind her, crowding my personal space to physically intimidate me. He glared at the silver tray in my hands, his lip curling in profound disgust. "This is an absolute disaster," he muttered, shaking his head. "Look at you. You look like a pathetic maid. If the Vanguard board members associate you with Devon and Sienna, it could ruin the entire aesthetic of the pitch. They are selling a vision of elite success, and you are standing here smelling like cheap coffee and failure." My mother squeezed my arm harder, her nails biting deep enough to leave crescent-shaped bruises. "You listen to me, Gwen," she threatened, her eyes blazing with cold fury. "This is the most important day of your sister's life. Devon is in there, securing our family's legacy. We are not going to let your pathetic, miserable presence ruin this deal." She leaned in closer, her expensive perfume suffocating the space between us. "When you go in there to serve that water, you keep your head down. Do not look at the board members. Do not speak to anyone. You are invisible, do you understand me? You pour the water, you back away, and you leave the room immediately. Do not you dare embarrass your sister or Devon by acting like you know them. Remember your exact place in this world." She spoke to me as if I were a stray dog that had wandered into a palace. She genuinely believed her words were cutting me down, enforcing the hierarchy she had established 5 years ago when she threw me out into the freezing rain. I let her finish. I let her pour every ounce of her toxic entitlement into the quiet hallway. I felt the physical sting of her nails, but emotionally I felt absolutely nothing but a brilliant, soaring anticipation. She did not know that my cheap intern blouse concealed a highly sensitive, encrypted microtransmitter. The tiny lapel microphone was patched directly into the secure earpieces of Jonathan Pierce and Elias Thorne, who were sitting just a few feet away inside the boardroom. The two most powerful men in the building were currently listening to every single vicious, abusive word my parents were hissing at me. I looked into my mother's angry eyes. I did not flinch. I did not pull my arm away. Instead, I let a slow, serene smile spread across my face. The sheer confidence radiating from my expression caused her to falter. Her grip on my arm loosened slightly in absolute confusion. I reached up with my free hand and deliberately tapped the hidden microphone on my lapel twice. "Do not worry, Mother," I replied. My voice was no longer the quiet whisper of a defeated intern. It was clear, commanding, and laced with absolute authority. "I know exactly what my place is today. I will make sure everyone in that room gets exactly what they deserve." Before she could process the weight of my words or question my sudden shift in demeanor, I smoothly pulled my arm out of her grasp. I turned my back on both of my stunned parents, balanced the silver tray perfectly in my hands, and walked directly toward the towering mahogany doors of the boardroom. I did not look back as I pushed the heavy doors open, stepping out of the shadows and directly into the blinding light of the execution chamber. I stepped out of the shadows and directly into the blinding light of the execution chamber. The Vanguard Executive Boardroom was a masterpiece of corporate intimidation. It was a cavernous space framed entirely by floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a dizzying panoramic view of the Manhattan skyline. The center of the room was dominated by a massive table carved from a single slab of dark mahogany. The air conditioning hummed at a crisp, freezing temperature designed to keep executives alert and nervous founders sweating. I walked through the heavy wooden doors with the silver tray balanced perfectly on my palms, the ice clinking softly against the crystal water glasses. At the absolute head of the table sat Jonathan Pierce. The CEO of Vanguard wore an impeccably tailored navy suit, his posture rigid and commanding. He projected an aura of absolute authority, surveying the room with eyes as cold and calculating as a great white shark. He was the man everyone in the financial district feared, and he was currently playing his role to absolute perfection. Sitting immediately to Jonathan's right was Elias Thorne. The contrast between the two men was almost comical. While Jonathan looked like a ruthless corporate conqueror, the billionaire founder of Vanguard looked like a lost, confused elderly man who had accidentally wandered off the street. Elias wore his signature faded brown cardigan, his shoulders slightly hunched, and his thick glasses perched precariously on the bridge of his nose. He sat quietly, his hands resting on his lap, observing the room with a mild, unassuming expression. To the untrained eye, he was a nobody. Perhaps a legacy board member suffering from dementia kept around purely out of pity. That was exactly how Devin and Sienna were treating him. Devin stood at the front of the room, positioned directly beside a massive digital projection screen displaying the complex plagiarized algorithms of Apex Solutions. He was in his element, radiating an aggressive, charismatic energy that filled the entire boardroom. He spoke with the smooth, practiced cadence of a master salesman. Beside him, seated at the edge of the mahogany table, was my sister Sienna. She sat with her legs elegantly crossed, a designer pen resting loosely in her manicured fingers. She wore a look of smug, triumphant satisfaction. She genuinely believed she was moments away from securing $50 million. My parents, Cynthia and Richard, slipped into the room just seconds after I did. They were escorted to a pair of plush observation chairs positioned at the back of the boardroom, reserved specifically for VYP partners and family members of the founders. As my mother took her seat, her eyes darted toward me. She shot me a severe, silent glare, a final warning to remain utterly invisible. I kept my face entirely blank, my gaze locked on the silver tray in my hands as I began to circle the room. I approached Jonathan Pierce first, setting a crystal glass of ice water smoothly onto a leather coaster beside his notepad. He did not look up, but I saw the slightest tightening in his jaw. The hidden microphone on my lapel was transmitting a live feed directly to his earpiece. He had heard every single word of my mother's vicious ambush in the hallway. He knew exactly what kind of people were sitting in his boardroom. I moved to Elias Thorne. As I placed his water glass down, the elderly billionaire gave me a microscopic, almost imperceptible nod. The brilliant, razor-sharp intellect hiding behind his thick glasses flashed for just a fraction of a second. He was ready. I continued down the length of the table, eventually reaching Sienna. I placed a glass down next to her stolen designer handbag. She did not even bother to look up at me. She simply shifted her chair slightly, physically distancing herself from the lowly intern serving her drinks. Devin, standing just a few feet away, completely ignored my presence. To him, I was just a piece of the furniture, an irrelevant prop in the grand theater of his success. Devin directed every ounce of his charm, his eye contact and his aggressive flattery exclusively toward Jonathan Pierce. Devin had clearly done his homework on Vanguard's corporate structure, but he had fallen into the ultimate trap of superficiality. Because Elias Thorne was not listed on any public executive roster, Devin assumed the old man in the cardigan was entirely powerless. At one point, Devin actually stepped sideways, physically blocking Elias's view of the projection screen, so he could maintain a direct, unbroken line of sight with Jonathan. Devin was literally turning his back on the wealthiest man in the room, dismissing the silent billionaire as irrelevant. "Gentlemen," Devin said, his voice rising to a confident theatrical crescendo as he pointed toward the projected revenue charts. "What you are looking at is not just an algorithm. It is a paradigm shift. Apex Solutions is operating with zero toxic liabilities and maintaining a flawlessly clean balance sheet. We have eliminated risk. We have perfected the predictive model. All we need is the fuel to ignite the engine." He slapped his hand flat against the mahogany table, leaning forward to look Jonathan directly in the eye. "We are requesting immediate authorization for the $50 million capital transfer," Devin stated boldly. "We need the funds released today to finalize our global infrastructure protocols. Partner with us, Jonathan. Give us the authorization today, and I personally guarantee Vanguard will see a return on investment that shatters every existing metric on Wall Street." The tension in the boardroom was thick enough to choke on. The silence stretched out heavy and palpable. From my position, standing quietly against the back wall, holding my empty silver tray, I could see my parents holding their breath. Cynthia was gripping the armrests of her chair, her knuckles turning white. Richard was leaning forward, his eyes shining with pure, unadulterated greed. They thought they had won. They thought the $15 million of crippling debt hanging over their heads was about to be instantly vaporized by Vanguard's money. They thought their golden child had secured their lavish future. Jonathan Pierce remained completely motionless. He steepled his fingers, letting Devon's arrogant demand hang in the freezing air of the boardroom. Jonathan's face revealed absolutely nothing. He looked at Devon, then shifted his gaze slightly to look at the massive screen displaying my stolen, mathematically flawed research. So Jonathan finally spoke, his voice dangerously soft and calm. "You are telling this board that your proprietary code is completely flawless and your company is entirely free of hidden debt. You stand by those claims, absolutely." "Absolutely," Devon replied without a single second of hesitation, flashing his brightest, most charming smile. "Apex Solutions is a fortress. There are no holes in our armor." Sienna nodded enthusiastically, in agreement, entirely blind to the financial execution about to take place. The trap was now fully, irreversibly set. Devon had locked himself inside a cage of his own lies, and he had just handed Vanguard the legal right to destroy him. I stood perfectly still against the wall, fading into the background exactly as my mother had demanded, waiting for the silent billionaire to raise his hand. Jonathan Pierce leaned forward, his hands resting flat against the polished mahogany table. He opened his mouth to deliver what Devon and Sienna firmly believed would be their $50 million victory speech. The entire room held its breath. Cynthia and Richard leaned forward in their plush observation chairs at the back of the room, their eyes wide with greedy anticipation. But before a single syllable could escape the CEO's lips, a slow, deliberate movement caught everyone's attention. Sitting immediately to Jonathan's right, the unassuming elderly man in the faded brown cardigan raised his right hand. The movement was completely silent, but it struck the room with the force of a physical blow. The absolute stillness that followed was deafening. Jonathan immediately closed his mouth and sat back in his chair, yielding the floor entirely. To Devon and Sienna, this gesture made absolutely no sense. They had spent the entire presentation directing their aggressive charms solely at Jonathan, entirely convinced that the quiet old man was nothing more than a senile board member or a charity case kept around for corporate optics. Devon let out a sharp, frustrated sigh. His perfectly manicured mask of corporate professionalism slipped for just a fraction of a second. He leaned down toward Sienna, shielding his mouth with his hand, and whispered a derogatory, racially tinged joke about the old man. I could read his lips perfectly from my position against the back wall. He muttered a cruel comment about how out of touch old white money was, joking that someone forgot to give the fossil his dementia medication before wheeling him into the boardroom. Sienna covered her mouth, stifling a small, arrogant giggle. She glanced at the elderly man with a look of profound disdain, completely underestimating the immense danger sitting just 3 feet away from her. They were both so blinded by their own superficial vanity that they could not recognize absolute power when it was staring them right in the face. Elias Thorne did not speak a single word. He lowered his hand and turned his head to look directly at Devon. The mild, confused expression he had worn throughout the entire presentation vanished instantly. His eyes turned into chips of glacial ice, radiating a terrifying, calculating brilliance. Then Elias raised both of his hands and began to move them. His fingers flew through the air in sharp, aggressive, and highly precise gestures. He was signing in American Sign Language. The movements were not frantic or confused. They were the deliberate, commanding keystrokes of a man dismantling an empire. He locked eyes with Devon, his facial expressions conveying a mixture of intense scrutiny and absolute disgust, his hands painting a silent narrative of financial execution in the freezing air of the boardroom. Devon stared at him in utter bewilderment. His arrogant smile faltered, replaced by a look of profound irritation. He looked toward Jonathan, expecting the CEO to intervene and stop the old man from disrupting their million-dollar moment. When Jonathan did nothing, Devon decided to take control of the room himself. He stepped away from the projection screen and projected his voice with patronizing, forced patience. "Excuse me," Devon said smoothly, raising his palms in a gesture of false concern. "Is there a medical emergency happening here? Can someone please assist this gentleman? We are trying to finalize a major corporate transaction, and I believe he might be having some sort of episode." The sheer disrespect in Devon's voice echoed off the glass walls. In the back of the room, my father, Richard, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, sensing that his son-in-law had just made a catastrophic miscalculation. Jonathan Pierce stood up. The heavy leather of his executive chair squeaked loudly in the tense silence. He did not address Devon. He did not even look at the man who had just demanded $50 million. Jonathan turned his body entirely toward Elias, his posture reflecting the utmost reverence and submission. The sudden, undeniable display of deference from the most feared man on Wall Street hit Devon like a physical strike. Devon took a step back, his arrogant facade crumbling as he suddenly realized he had entirely misread the hierarchy of the room. Jonathan turned his piercing gaze to the rest of the boardroom. His voice was cold, sharp, and laced with undeniable authority. "Mr. Thorne has some severe concerns regarding this portfolio," Jonathan announced, clearly his words slicing through the heavy silence. The name hit the room like a thunderclap. Thorne. Even Devon, blinded by his own ego, recognized the name of the legendary billionaire founder of Vanguard Investments. The realization that he had just mocked the majority shareholder, the man who personally owned the very funds he was trying to secure, washed over Devon in a wave of visible horror. He opened his mouth to apologize, to scramble and salvage the situation with his weaponized charm, but Jonathan cut him off before he could speak a single word. "Is there anyone in this room qualified to interpret for our majority shareholder?" Jonathan asked, his voice echoing across the mahogany table. The boardroom fell into a state of absolute paralyzed silence. Devon stood frozen by the projection screen, his tailored suit suddenly looking like a cheap costume. Sienna clutched her stolen designer handbag, her eyes darting frantically around the room, desperate for someone to step forward and fix the collapsing situation. In the observation chairs, Cynthia and Richard sat completely rigid, the blood draining from their faces as they realized their golden child's victory was rapidly turning into a nightmare. No one moved. No one breathed. They were completely trapped. I took a slow, deliberate breath. The cool air filled my lungs, bringing with it a soaring, intoxicating rush of adrenaline. The moment I had planned for the moment, I had survived 5 years of hell to reach, had finally arrived. I stepped away from the back wall. I walked quietly to the polished wooden credenza and set the heavy silver tray of water glasses down. The clink of the crystal against the metal was exceptionally loud in the dead silent room. Every head in the boardroom snapped toward the sound. I stepped out of the shadows and walked directly into the center of the brilliant, blinding light pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows. My cheap gray skirt and intern lanyard stood out in stark contrast to the bespoke suits and designer dresses surrounding the mahogany table. I did not keep my head down. I did not make myself invisible. I walked with the absolute terrifying confidence of a woman who held the financial fate of everyone in the room in the palm of her hand. Sienna turned around in her leather chair, her eyes locked onto mine. For a split second she looked annoyed that the lowly intern was interrupting the meeting, but as she registered my face, as she saw the fierce, unyielding fire burning in my eyes, the color completely and instantly drained from her skin. Her jaw dropped slightly. The smug, triumphant satisfaction she had worn since walking into the lobby shattered into a million pieces. Cynthia gasped loudly from the back of the room, her hand flying to her mouth in sheer horror. She recognized the look on my face. She knew in that exact second that I had not poured the water and backed away as she commanded. I walked right past my trembling sister and took my place at the front of the boardroom, standing shoulder to shoulder with the billionaire founder of Vanguard Investments. I stood shoulder to shoulder with Elias Thorne, turning slowly to face the sprawling mahogany table. The absolute silence in the cavernous room was heavy, thick with the unsaid realization that the power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. Devon stared at me, his eyes darting frantically from my cheap blue intern badge to the billionaire sitting calmly beside me. His charismatic smile had completely vanished, replaced by a tight, nervous grimace that made his bespoke charcoal suit suddenly look like a suffocating cage. Sienna gripped the armrests of her leather chair, her knuckles turning bone white as she glared up at me with a mixture of profound confusion and visceral hatred. In the back of the room, my parents remained frozen in their plush observation chairs, effectively trapped in the nightmare they had unknowingly walked into. Elias did not waste a single second. He looked directly at Devon, his eyes narrowing with predatory focus, and raised his hands. His fingers moved with rapid, lethal precision, cutting through the freezing air of the boardroom. I watched his gestures, carefully absorbing the sheer magnitude of his financial intellect, and then I opened my mouth. I projected my voice across the vast room, ensuring every single syllable struck with absolute clarity. Mr. Thorne says your presentation is a masterful work of corporate fiction. I translated my tone, matching Elias's cold authority perfectly. He commends your graphic design team on the visuals, but notes that your underlying financial architecture is fundamentally hollow. Devon flinched violently, as if I had physically struck him across the face. He took a stumbling step toward the table, raising his hands in a defensive, placating posture. Now, hold on just a minute, Devon stammered, his smooth baritone voice cracking slightly under the pressure. I do not know what this intern thinks she is doing, Jonathan, but these numbers are absolutely solid. We have provided full transparency regarding our operational costs and projected revenue. Elias did not even look at Jonathan. He kept his piercing gaze locked entirely on Devon and signed again, his movements accelerating into a blur of aggressive accusation. Mr. Thorne disagrees. I translated, stepping slightly forward into the light. He points specifically to the projected revenue streams outlined on slide 14. You claim these figures represent organic growth from new enterprise contracts. However, Mr. Thorne notes a glaring discrepancy in your cash flow statements. The capital is not originating from legitimate client acquisitions. It is being routed through an interconnected web of offshore shell entities located in the Cayman Islands. You are taking on massive high-interest loans and disguising them as clean revenue to artificially inflate your company's valuation prior to this pitch. The color completely drained from Devon's face, leaving him looking sickly and pale. He looked wildly around the room, desperately searching the faces of the senior board members for any sign of support, but found only stern, unforgiving stares. The financial guillotine was lowering rapidly, and he was the one who had willingly placed his head on the chopping block. That is an outrageous, baseless accusation, Devon said, a thick bead of sweat breaking out on his forehead and rolling down his cheek. We operate with complete regulatory compliance. This translation must be deliberately flawed. She is just an intern. She does not understand the complexities of our advanced financial modeling. Elias's hands moved again, sharper and significantly more aggressive this time. Mr. Thorne understands your models perfectly. I translated, my voice steady and unwavering. He notes that you have conveniently omitted your most catastrophic liabilities from this $50 million pitch. Specifically, a highly toxic mezzanine debt package totaling exactly $15 million. You have leveraged your corporate servers, your intellectual property, your personal penthouse, and your in-laws' suburban estate to secure these shadow loans. You are not standing here seeking expansion capital, Devon. You are begging Vanguard to bail you out before your predatory creditors legally seize your entire existence. Devon physically stumbled backward, hitting the projection screen. His shoulders slumped, and the last remaining shreds of his arrogant charm evaporated into thin air. He looked like a cornered animal, wiping the sweat from his brow, opening his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The sheer accuracy of the financial teardown had completely paralyzed him. He knew he was caught. He knew his massive fraud had been laid bare in front of the most powerful investors in the world. Sienna could no longer contain herself. Seeing her husband publicly dismantled by the older sister she had spent her entire life stepping on was entirely too much for her fragile ego to bear. She shot up from her chair, slamming her manicured hands onto the mahogany table. Her diamond ring cracked loudly against the wood. "This is an absolute joke!" Sienna shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly across the glass-walled room. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my face, her eyes blazing with desperate, toxic fury. "I do not know what kind of sick stunt you are trying to pull, Gwen, but you need to shut your mouth right now. You are making things up because you are jealous. You have always been terribly jealous of me and Devon." Sienna turned her desperate gaze to the CEO. Jonathan, you cannot possibly be listening to her. She is a complete fraud. She is a 33-year-old college dropout who sleeps on couches. She is nothing but a failed, pathetic intern who cannot even hold down a real job. Tell her to stop signing these ridiculous lies, fetch the coffee she was told to bring, and get out of this boardroom before she ruins this entire deal. From the back of the room, my mother Cynthia nodded vigorously, silently cheering on her golden child's vicious outburst. They still firmly believed they held the upper hand. They still believed the strict corporate hierarchy would protect them from the devastating truth I was delivering. The response was instantaneous and utterly brutal. Jonathan Pierce slammed his hand down on the mahogany table. The violent impact sounded exactly like a gunshot, instantly silencing Sienna's hysterical rant. He stood up slowly, drawing himself to his full, imposing height. His cold, calculating eyes locked onto my sister with an expression of pure, unfiltered disgust. "You will sit down immediately," Jonathan commanded, his voice rumbling with terrifying absolute power. "And you will show some respect in my boardroom." Sienna flinched, physically recoiling from the sheer force of his authority. She sank back into her leather chair, her mouth hanging slightly open in absolute shock. Devon remained frozen by the projection screen, terrified to make a single sound. Jonathan looked around the vast room, making absolutely sure every single person was paying close attention. Then he turned his gaze toward me, offering a deep, respectful nod before delivering the final, devastating reality check to my family. "The woman standing at the front of this room is not an intern," Jonathan stated clearly, enunciating every single word, so there could be absolutely no misunderstanding. "She is not fetching your coffee, and she is certainly not a failure. Allow me to formally introduce you to Gwen. She is the lead asset manager and the sole authorized proxy for the Thorne estate. She is Vanguard's top portfolio manager, and as of this morning she holds the unilateral power to approve or deny your $50 million request." The silence that followed was absolute. I stood at the front of the room, looking at the horrified, shattered faces of the family who had thrown me away completely, ready to deliver the final blow. I turned away from my stunned family and walked directly toward the projection screen. The complex algorithmic models of Apex Solutions glowed brightly, illuminating the absolute panic setting in on Devon's face. He stepped aside involuntarily as I reached out and tapped a specific mathematical sequence displayed on the glass. "Mr. Thorne does not just have concerns about your hidden debts," I said, my voice echoing in the vast boardroom. "He has severe concerns about the actual engine of your company. You see, when you present a predictive financial model to a room full of billionaires, you should probably understand the math yourself." I pointed to the third line of the projected code. "I wrote this exact algorithm 5 years ago on my laptop while sitting at my parents' kitchen table. When you and Sienna kicked me out into the freezing rain, you stole my research and used it to launch your entire fraudulent empire. But you made a catastrophic mistake. You stole a rough draft." Sienna gasped loudly from her seat, her face turning ashen. Devon swallowed hard, heavy drops of sweat, actively dripping down his neck and staining his bespoke collar. "There are 3 fatal flaws in this code," I explained, pacing slowly in front of the massive screen. "First, the risk assessment loop completely collapses during high volatility market shifts, generating false positive returns that disguise massive losses. Second, the data aggregation node fails to account for inflation compounding, creating a massive ghost equity bubble that looks like profit on paper. And third, the entire system is built around a backdoor logic failsafe that I intentionally embedded to sabotage anyone who tried to execute my uncompleted work without the proper encryption key." I turned to face Devon, completely locking my eyes onto his terrified expression. "Explain the math, Devon. Explain how you plan to fix the volatility loop. You are the visionary tech founder. Show the Vanguard executives how your brilliant mind solves the equation." Devon stood absolutely frozen. He opened his mouth, but only a desperate, suffocating wheeze escaped. His eyes darted frantically across the equations on the screen, desperately searching for an answer to a language he did not speak. The silence in the room stretched out, heavy and punishing. The board members watched with undisguised disgust as the charismatic fraudster completely unraveled before their very eyes. In a sudden, violent burst of panic, Devin spun around and pointed an accusing finger straight at my sister. "This is your fault!" he screamed, his voice cracking with absolute hysteria. "You told me the data was perfect. You swore you had her finished thesis. You handed me a broken system and told me to build a company on it." Sienna jumped up violently, knocking her leather chair backward against the mahogany table. "Do not you dare blame me for your failures," she shrieked, her perfectly curated image entirely destroyed. "You are the one who mismanaged the funds. You blew millions on bad trades because you are completely incompetent." The flawless facade of the golden couple instantly shattered into a million jagged pieces. They screamed at each other right there in the boardroom, viciously tearing their marriage and their empire apart. My parents watched in absolute horror from the back of the room as their carefully constructed world burned to the ground. The elite unity they had prized above my own life was now nothing more than ash and bitter accusations. Watching their golden child unravel was finally too much for my parents to bear. Cynthia and Richard leaped from their plush observation chairs at the back of the boardroom and rushed toward the mahogany table. My mother pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face, her voice shrill with desperate indignation. "Jonathan, you must stop this immediately," Cynthia demanded, stepping protectively in front of a still screaming Sienna. "This is an elaborate setup orchestrated by a jealous, vindictive intern. She has harbored a pathological grudge against her successful sister for years. I demand that you have security remove her from this building and fire her on the spot. My husband and I will not sit here and watch our family legacy be destroyed by a bitter dropout who fetches coffee." My father stood beside her, his face flushed red with exertion. He looked at the Vanguard executives with a frantic, pleading expression. "We assure you, gentlemen, Devin and Sienna are brilliant innovators. Do not let the fabricated lies of a disgruntled low-level employee ruin a $50 million partnership." Jonathan Pierce did not call for security. He did not ask me to leave. Instead, a low, cold laugh escaped the CEO's lips. The sound cut through the shouting and echoed off the glass walls, bringing an immediate chilling halt to my parents' frantic defense. "Fire her," Jonathan asked, his voice laced with profound, razor-sharp amusement. "Cynthia, I am afraid you are suffering from a severe delusion regarding who actually holds the power in this room." Jonathan stood up, fully buttoning his suit jacket with deliberate slowness. He gestured toward me with open, absolute respect. "Allow me to properly introduce you to the woman you keep calling an intern," Jonathan announced, ensuring every single syllable struck them like a physical blow. "Gwen is not fetching coffee, and she is certainly not a low-level employee. She is the sole authorized proxy and the lead asset manager for the Thorne estate. She manages the private wealth of our founder, Elias Thorne." My parents froze completely. Their mouths fell open in synchronized, absolute shock. The aggressive, entitled posture drained from their bodies in an instant. "And since it is Mr. Thorne's personal capital funding this specific venture," Jonathan continued relentlessly, "Gwen is the only person on this entire continent who holds the legal authority to approve or deny your $50 million request. Your golden children did not come here to pitch to me today. They came here to beg her for mercy." The devastating realization slammed into Cynthia and Richard like a runaway freight train. They turned their heads, slowly staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. The daughter they had discarded, the woman they had thrown into the freezing rain and dismissed as a permanent failure, was the absolute master of their financial fate. Their entire world now rested entirely in my hands. The silence that consumed the room was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. I reached into the pocket of my cheap gray skirt and pulled out the crumpled $50 bill Devin had thrown at my wet shoes in the lobby. I flattened the damp, stained paper between my fingers and tossed it onto the center of the massive mahogany table. It landed right in front of Devin with a soft, pathetic slap. "Buy yourself a new shirt, Devin," I said, throwing his exact words back into his face. "Keep the change for your failed career. You are going to need it." I did not give him a single second to respond. I unzipped the sleek leather portfolio Jonathan had provided me earlier and pulled out a thick stack of legal acquisition documents stamped with the Vanguard seal. I dropped the heavy files onto the table. The sound cracked like a whip in the silent room. I am not just denying the $50 million investment, I stated clearly, my voice carrying the absolute weight of a financial executioner. As of 6 o'clock this morning, acting as the proxy for the Thorne estate, I acquired 100% of Apex Solutions' $15 million toxic debt. I bought it all through private shell companies. I am your sole creditor, Devon, and I am officially calling in the loans. Your company is entirely bankrupt. Devon staggered backward. His knees hit the edge of a chair and he collapsed into it as if his bones had suddenly turned to dust. He grabbed his chest, gasping for air as the reality of his total financial ruin crashed over him. The arrogant tech founder was completely gone, replaced by a terrified, broken man staring at the absolute end of his life. Sienna let out a high, thin wail. She clutched her stolen designer handbag to her chest like a shield, her eyes darting frantically between me and the legal documents resting on the table. "And that luxury penthouse you live in?" I continued, turning my gaze directly to my sister. "The one you bought with my stolen inheritance. You used it as secondary collateral to secure those predatory shadow loans. It belongs to me now. I own it." Sienna let out a guttural scream. She covered her face with her hands, sobbing uncontrollably as the illusion of her perfect, wealthy lifestyle completely disintegrated. The golden child was stripped of her crown. My parents looked like they had been physically struck by lightning. Richard clutched the edge of the observation chair, his face turning an alarming shade of purple as he realized his prestigious social standing was dead. Cynthia stood frozen, her jaw trembling violently. The elite suburban estate she prized above her own daughter had also been listed as collateral. They knew they had lost absolutely everything. The devastating, magnificent ruin of the family that threw me away was now complete, and I stood over the ashes of their empire without a single drop of mercy. The sheer weight of their destruction finally shattered the last remaining shreds of Devon's manufactured charm. He let out a guttural roar of pure animalistic rage. He lunged across the mahogany table, his hands outstretched violently, attempting to grab me by the throat. He screamed that I was a thief, a liar, a bitter spinster, trying to ruin a better man's life. He never even made it past the digital projector. Jonathan Pierce had already anticipated the outburst. At a subtle nod from the CEO, 3 massive corporate security guards who had been quietly standing by the entrance sprang into action. They tackled Devon to the floor with ruthless efficiency, pinning his arms behind his back and pressing his face hard against the polished hardwood. He thrashed and cursed his bespoke suit, tearing at the shoulder, utterly humiliated in front of the most powerful executives in New York. In the back of the room, my father Richard stumbled backward. He clutched his chest, his face turning an alarming shade of gray as he collapsed heavily into his observation chair. The reality of his catastrophic financial ruin had finally breached his stubborn denial. The sprawling suburban estate he prized above all else, his entire golden retirement fund, all of it was legally bound to the toxic debt I now owned. He was entirely destitute. My mother, Cynthia, seeing her husband gasping for air, and her golden son-in-law pinned to the ground like a common criminal, completely abandoned her elite socialite persona. The haughty, demanding matriarch who had ambushed me in the hallway just 30 minutes prior suddenly dropped heavily to her knees right there on the boardroom floor. Her emerald green dress pooled around her as she crawled desperately toward my sensible shoes. "Gwen, please." Cynthia sobbed, tears streaming down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. "You cannot do this to us. You cannot take our home. We raised you. We are your family. Blood is thicker than water, Gwen. You have to show us some mercy." I looked down at the woman who had kicked me out into the freezing rain when I had absolutely nothing left. I stepped back smoothly, pulling my skirt out of her frantic, grasping reach. I felt completely unfazed by her performative tears. She was not crying because she regretted hurting me. She was crying because she had finally lost. "Blood might be thicker than water," I stated, my voice echoing with icy, absolute finality. But it does not pay the mortgage, Cynthia. And if I recall correctly, you made the rules of this house very clear 5 years ago. There is no place for failures in this family. I turned my attention to the head of corporate security. Please escort these unauthorized individuals out of the building. Have them leave their access badges at the front desk. The guards hauled Devin to his feet and dragged him toward the heavy wooden doors. Sienna followed closely behind, weeping hysterically, her stolen designer bag left completely forgotten on the conference table. My mother sobbed as my father leaned on her for support, shuffling out of the boardroom in absolute disgrace. I stood shoulder to shoulder with Elias Thorne, watching them disappear into the hallway, knowing they were walking out into a world where I held the deed to their entire existence. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut, sealing the fate of the family that had tried to destroy me. The suffocating tension inside the Vanguard boardroom instantly dissolved, replaced by a profound, echoing quiet that felt incredibly sweet. Jonathan Pierce let out a long, slow breath and adjusted his suit jacket, turning to me with a look of absolute, undisguised respect. Beside him, Elias Thorne raised his hands, a genuine warm smile forming on his weathered face. He signed that the execution was flawless, praising my tactical precision and unwavering focus. I had successfully excised the rot from his portfolio and reclaimed my own stolen dignity in a single devastating maneuver. The war was officially over, and the cleanup was about to begin. The fallout was exceptionally swift and brutally public. Because Devin had utilized interstate bank transfers and falsified financial projections to solicit institutional capital. His actions triggered an immediate federal investigation by the Securities and Exchange Commission. By Tuesday morning, the polished tech founder was the lead story on every major financial news network. I sat at my new desk in the executive suite sipping hot coffee while watching the live broadcast unfold on the large flat-screen monitor. Federal agents escorted Devin out of the Apex Solutions headquarters in handcuffs. His bespoke suit was wrinkled and torn, his head bowed low to hide his face from the flashing cameras of the aggressive paparazzi. He was officially indicted on multiple counts of investor fraud, wire fraud, and grand larceny. The charismatic facade that had fooled my parents was entirely shattered, exposing him as a common criminal facing decades in federal prison. There would be no clever deals or plea bargains to save him this time. With Devin completely neutralized and his assets formally seized by the government, the remaining dominoes fell rapidly. As the legal owner of the toxic debt, I authorized the immediate foreclosure on the luxury penthouse that had served as Sienna's personal palace. The eviction was executed with cold corporate efficiency. There was no leniency, no second chances, and absolutely no extension granted. Sienna was forced to pack whatever meager belongings the federal investigators had not confiscated and vacate the premises under the watchful eye of a court-appointed bailiff. The golden child who had spent her entire adult life dripping in stolen designer brands and mocking my daily struggles was suddenly reduced to carrying cheap cardboard boxes out of a dusty service elevator. She had no money, no wealthy husband to rely on, and no elite social circle willing to answer her desperate phone calls. Her former friends vanished the very moment the federal indictments hit the press, treating her like a highly contagious disease they needed to avoid at all costs. My parents suffered a uniquely poetic form of absolute devastation. Cynthia and Richard had proudly used their sprawling suburban estate as collateral to guarantee Devin's fraudulent shadow loans. When the final default notice was served, they lost absolutely everything they held dear. The massive, pristine house where they had held their exclusive dinner parties and banished me into the freezing rain was legally repossessed. Stripped of their wealth and completely humiliated in the public eye, they were forced to relocate to a tiny, heavily mortgaged suburban duplex on the extreme outskirts of the city. Their prestigious country club memberships were instantly revoked. Their wealthy socialite friends stopped inviting them to charity galas, entirely terrified of being associated with a massive federal fraud scandal. Cynthia and Richard were condemned to live out their golden retirement in absolute financial destitution, trapped in a cramped house with the very daughter they had groomed for perfection. They had sacrificed their eldest child to build an empire, and now they were forced to sit in the ashes of that empire, staring at each other in bitter, unforgiving silence for the rest of their lives. While they languished in the ruin they had created, my life expanded into a brilliant new reality. I stood on the expansive glass balcony of Vanguard's penthouse suite, the crisp evening wind rushing past me as I looked out over the glittering expanse of Manhattan. The city lights stretched out endlessly, a sprawling canvas of power, security, and endless possibility. Jonathan Pierce stood to my left holding a crystal glass of sparkling water, treating me not as a subordinate, but as a trusted, highly valued equal. Elias Thorne stood to my right, resting his hands comfortably on the balcony railing. Through my ruthless execution of the black market debt acquisition, I had not only protected Vanguard from a catastrophic $50 million loss, but I had reclaimed my stolen inheritance tenfold. The assets I legally stripped from Devon's collapsed company fundamentally secured my financial independence for the rest of my life. I was no longer an invisible intern fetching lattes. I was a force to be reckoned with. More importantly than the vast wealth, I had finally found the validation I had spent my entire youth desperately seeking. I did not find it in the conditional love of my toxic parents or the superficial approval of high society. I found it in the unyielding respect of two titans of Wall Street who saw my raw intellect and gave me the exact tools I needed to wield it effectively. Elias and Jonathan became the mentors I always deserved, guiding my career with fierce loyalty and profound trust. They judged me entirely by my actions and my character, rewarding my dedication with genuine mentorship. Looking out over the illuminated skyline, I realized the most valuable lesson of my entire journey. Family is not simply about sharing blood or a matching last name. It is about who respects your worth, who protects your peace, and who stands beside you when you are at your absolute lowest. The people who share your DNA are not entitled to your future if they actively choose to destroy your present. You owe nothing to those who only value you when you are useful to their selfish narratives. Life isn't about the hand you were dealt, it's about how you play your hidden cards. If you enjoyed this story of reclaiming power, drop a comment, hit subscribe, and share it with someone who needs a reminder of their own strength. The most profound lesson to be drawn from Gwen's journey is that true family is not forged by shared genetics, but by mutual respect, unwavering support, and genuine appreciation of one's worth. For years, Gwen was trapped in a toxic cycle, forced to sacrifice her inheritance, her career, and her dignity to uphold the superficial facade of her relatives. Her biological parents and sister weaponized the concept of family to manipulate and extort her, discarding her the exact moment she was no longer financially useful. This narrative shatters the societal myth that we are inherently obligated to tolerate abuse from those who share our bloodline. Gwen's ultimate triumph was not merely a financial victory, it was a psychological emancipation. By securing her own secret empire and aligning herself with mentors like Elias Thorne and Jonathan Pierce, people who judged her purely on her raw intellect and character, she proved that we have the absolute right to choose our family. True allies do not demand that you make yourself small so they can feel big. Furthermore, the story teaches us the unmatched power of silent resilience. Instead of reacting emotionally to her family's cruel provocations in the lobby or the boardroom, Gwen channeled her pain into calculated preparation. She allowed her detractors to underestimate her, using their blinding arrogance as the very tool to dismantle their fraudulent lives. Her journey serves as a powerful reminder that our value is never determined by the people who are too blind to see it. We owe absolutely nothing to those who only claim us when it serves their selfish agendas. Take control of your own narrative today. Walk away from toxic environments that diminish your light and start building a life surrounded by those who truly respect your absolute worth.